Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video that will not only help you improve your English but also give you an in-depth understanding of one of the most intense political moments of recent times. Imagine a high-stakes meeting between two world leaders. The room is tense, cameras are watching, and behind closed doors, words are exchanged that could change the course of international relations. On February 28, 2025, an official meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky took an unexpected turn, leading to a heated discussion that made headlines worldwide. But what really happened behind those doors? Why did this discussion escalate? And what does it mean for the future of US-Ukraine relations? Stay with us as we break down this dramatic event step by step. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming deep dives into history's most shocking moments. As February 28, 2025, approached, the anticipation surrounding the meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky reached its peak. It wasn't just another diplomatic encounter, it was a moment that could redefine the relationship between the United States and Ukraine. With war still raging in Eastern Europe and US political dynamics shifting, every move made by these two leaders would have enormous consequences. Behind the closed doors of the Trump International Hotel in Washington, D.C., both men prepared for a conversation that neither could afford to go wrong. But their objectives were far from aligned. For Volodymyr Zelensky, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Ukraine's war effort depended significantly on Western support, with the United States as its biggest backer. Since the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, Kyiv had relied on billions of dollars in U.S. aid, including weapons, intelligence, and financial assistance to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat. However, with the upcoming U.S. presidential election on the horizon, Zelensky faced growing concerns about what a potential Trump return to power would mean. Trump had long criticized continued aid to Ukraine, questioning why American taxpayers should fund a war overseas. Zelensky needed to secure a commitment, an assurance that, regardless of political shifts in Washington, Ukraine would not be abandoned. On the other side, Donald Trump had his own calculations to make. As the leading Republican candidate, he was focused on his return to the White House and knew that foreign policy was a hot-button issue for his base. His America First doctrine had always been skeptical of prolonged U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts. Many of his supporters were critical of what they saw as a blank check to Ukraine, especially when domestic issues like inflation, border security, and crime were dominating American concerns. Trump saw this meeting as an opportunity to assert his position that if he were to become president again, the era of unconditional U.S. aid to Ukraine could come to an end. He wasn't looking to offer reassurances to Zelensky. Instead, he wanted to make it clear that Ukraine would have to take on more responsibility for its own defense without relying so heavily on American support. Even before the meeting began, tensions were high. Zelensky's diplomatic team was on edge, aware of Trump's unpredictable nature. They knew that a single misstep could jeopardize future relations between the two countries. Meanwhile, Trump's advisors were equally cautious. They understood that any statement he made could become a headline within minutes, especially given the media's obsession with his stance on Ukraine. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the afternoon, away from the public eye, in a private suite at Trump's hotel. No journalists were allowed inside, but speculation ran wild. Was Trump about to make a deal? Would Zelensky walk away with the promises he needed? Or would this meeting turn into an open confrontation? As the two leaders finally sat across from each other, the weight of history pressed down on the room. Zelensky, determined and urgent, wasted no time in getting to the point. Trump, confident and unwavering, was prepared to push back. What started as a diplomatic discussion would soon spiral into one of the most talked-about political clashes of the year. The room was set. Inside the private suite of the Trump International Hotel, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Donald Trump sat confidently, his hands folded as he listened to the formal introductions. Volodymyr Zelensky, known for his passionate speeches and unwavering stance, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. The pleasantries were brief, as both men knew that what was at stake was far more important than diplomatic formalities. Zelensky spoke first. His tone was measured, but there was an undeniable urgency in his voice. He laid out Ukraine's position with precision, emphasizing the dire situation on the battlefield and the necessity of continued U.S. military aid. His argument was straightforward. Ukraine was not just fighting for its survival but also serving as the first line of defense against Russian aggression. If Ukraine fell, the consequences would extend far beyond its borders, sending a message to authoritarian regimes worldwide that Western democracies were unwilling to stand up to tyranny. He pointed to previous American commitments and stressed that a sudden withdrawal of support would not only cripple Ukraine's war effort but also damage the credibility of the United States as a reliable ally. Trump listened, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained firm. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same confidence that had defined his political career. He acknowledged Ukraine's struggle but quickly pivoted to his main concern, America's interests. He reminded Zelensky that the United States had already spent billions of dollars on the war and questioned whether continued assistance was truly in America's best interest. He spoke about the need to prioritize domestic issues, pointing out the growing dissatisfaction among the American public regarding foreign aid while economic challenges persisted at home. Zelensky was prepared for this argument, but what came next caught him off guard. Trump, in his characteristic blunt style, suggested that Ukraine should start negotiating with Russia instead of expecting indefinite U.S. support. He implied that a diplomatic solution, even if it meant making territorial concessions, might be the only realistic path forward. The suggestion was nothing short of a political earthquake. Zelensky, who had spent years rallying global support under the promise of not giving up an inch of Ukrainian land, immediately reacted. His face tensed as he responded with firm conviction, rejecting the idea of any compromise with Putin's regime. For him, any concession would be a betrayal of the thousands of Ukrainians who had sacrificed their lives defending their homeland. The room grew colder. Trump, unimpressed, leaned back and reiterated his position. He argued that his priority was putting America first, not engaging in endless foreign conflicts. He reminded Zelensky that, should he return to office, Ukraine could not expect the same level of assistance it had received under the Biden administration. He suggested that European nations should take on more responsibility and that the U.S. could not be expected to bear the financial burden alone. Zelensky, visibly frustrated, pushed back harder. He reminded Trump that weakening U.S. support would embolden Russia and potentially lead to a larger, more disastrous conflict, one that could eventually force NATO into direct confrontation with Moscow. He urged Trump to reconsider, emphasizing that a Ukrainian defeat would have ripple effects that could threaten global stability. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Both leaders held their ground, neither willing to concede an inch. The atmosphere had shifted from diplomatic negotiation to an open clash of worldviews. The tension was palpable, and those present in the room could feel that the meeting was quickly spiraling into something far more intense than initially expected. What had started as a strategic discussion was now turning into a heated exchange that would soon spill into the public eye. The question was no longer about whether the United States would continue its support for Ukraine, but rather about how deep the rift between these two leaders would grow. And as voices rose and expressions hardened, it became clear that this meeting was far from over. The conversation that had begun as a tense but diplomatic exchange was now quickly unraveling into something far more confrontational. As Zelensky stood his ground on Ukraine's absolute refusal to negotiate with Russia, Trump became visibly impatient. The former U.S. president, known for his blunt and often provocative rhetoric, was not accustomed to being challenged so directly. His tone sharpened as he accused Zelensky of expecting unlimited American support without offering a clear exit strategy for the war. Zelensky, unwilling to let such remarks go unchallenged, fired back. He reminded Trump of the Budapest Memorandum, the 1994 agreement in which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances from the U.S., the UK, and Russia. "You made a promise," he said, his voice carrying both frustration and defiance. America made a promise. But Trump was unmoved. He dismissed the argument, saying that past agreements meant little if they no longer served America's best interests. The frustration in the room escalated. Trump leaned forward, cutting Zelensky off mid-sentence. His voice grew louder as he insisted that Ukraine had to take more responsibility for its own defense. He accused European nations of not doing enough and questioned why the US was expected to foot the bill for a war thousands of miles away. "You should be talking to Germany, to France, to Poland," Trump said. "America can't keep writing blank checks." Zelensky's patience was wearing thin. His advisors, sitting silently nearby, exchanged uneasy glances as they saw the conversation veering into dangerous territory. The Ukrainian leader, usually composed in high-pressure situations, was now visibly agitated. He reminded Trump that this wasn't just about Ukraine, it was about the future of democracy, about stopping an aggressor before he became an even greater threat. "If Russia wins here," Zelensky said firmly, "they won't stop. Do you understand that?" Trump, however, was unmoved by the emotional appeal. He shook his head and, in an almost dismissive tone, suggested that maybe Ukraine should start considering different strategies, ones that didn't rely so heavily on American involvement. He repeated his stance that, under his leadership, the US would no longer provide aid without strict conditions. "Maybe it's time for Ukraine to start thinking differently," he said, his voice colder now. That was the moment when the discussion crossed the line from tense diplomacy to outright hostility. Zelensky, his patience completely exhausted, leaned forward and, in a low but firm voice, delivered what would later become one of the most widely quoted lines of the meeting: "If America turns its back on Ukraine, history will remember it. And so will your allies." The room fell into a heavy silence. Trump smirked slightly, as if unfazed, but the words had landed. His advisors shifted in their seats, recognizing the gravity of the moment. The battle lines had been drawn, not on the battlefield, but in this very room. The meeting was no longer about policy. It had become a direct clash of ideologies, a test of willpower between two leaders who refused to back down. And what happened next would send shockwaves far beyond the walls of that suite. The meeting had ended, but the aftershocks were only beginning. As soon as Zelensky left the Trump International Hotel, his expression was unreadable, but those who had been present in the room knew that the conversation had taken a disastrous turn. Within hours, leaks from both camps began to spread, fueling speculation about what had really transpired behind closed doors. Reports emerged that the discussion had turned explosive, with sources describing it as one of the most confrontational diplomatic meetings in recent history. While no official statements were made immediately, the tone of the Ukrainian delegation as they left the meeting spoke volumes. Zelensky's aides remained tight-lipped, refusing to answer questions from journalists swarming outside the hotel. Meanwhile, inside the building, Trump's team was already working on damage control, attempting to frame the meeting as a frank and productive discussion. But the truth was becoming harder to contain. It didn't take long for the media to seize the story, with major outlets running headlines speculating on the collapse of US-Ukraine relations. CNN reported that the meeting had ended in a diplomatic disaster, while Fox News focused on Trump's firm stance against what it called unchecked foreign aid. Social media exploded with reactions, with supporters of both leaders engaging in fierce debates over whether the US should continue backing Ukraine or whether Trump was right to push for a change in policy. But the most significant reactions came from world leaders. Within hours, European allies of Ukraine voiced deep concern over the apparent breakdown in talks. The German Chancellor and the French President released statements reaffirming their commitment to supporting Ukraine, subtly implying that if the US withdrew, Europe would have to take on an even greater role. In Moscow, the Kremlin's response was more revealing. State media celebrated the reports of tension, calling it a sign that Western unity was beginning to crack. Russian officials wasted no time in exploiting the division, with propagandists claiming that Trump's remarks were proof that Ukraine was losing Western patience. On the American side, the political impact was immediate and severe. Members of Congress from both parties reacted strongly, with Democrats condemning Trump's apparent willingness to distance the U.S. from Ukraine. Some Republicans, particularly those aligned with Trump's nationalist agenda, praised his tough stance, arguing that it was time to reassess America's involvement in foreign wars. However, others within the Republican establishment expressed concern over the diplomatic fallout, warning that alienating Ukraine could damage U.S. credibility on the world stage. Zelensky, refusing to let the narrative slip away, decided to take a bold step. The next morning, in a carefully staged press conference, he addressed the world. With cameras flashing and microphones capturing every word, he stood firm, stating, "Ukraine will never surrender, regardless of who stands with us or who abandons us. Our fight is not just ours, it is a fight for freedom, for sovereignty, and for the future of Europe." It was a clear message, not just to his people but also to Trump and any leader who thought Ukraine could be pressured into submission. But the damage had been done. The meeting had not only revealed deep divisions between Trump and Zelensky but had also sent shockwaves through international diplomacy. As the world absorbed the consequences, one question remained: what would happen next? The heated exchange between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky on February 28, 2025, had already sent diplomatic and political shockwaves across the globe, but its true impact was only beginning to unfold. In the days that followed, both leaders were forced to navigate the fallout, as their confrontation became a defining moment not only in U.S. Ukraine relations but in the broader geopolitical landscape. For Trump, the meeting had solidified his America First stance on foreign policy, energizing his base while deepening divisions within the Republican Party. His refusal to commit to continued aid for Ukraine was praised by his most loyal supporters, who viewed it as a rejection of what they saw as unnecessary U.S. entanglements in foreign wars. However, the backlash from establishment Republicans and foreign policy experts was swift. Many warned that Trump's dismissive attitude toward Ukraine could embolden Russia and undermine U.S. alliances worldwide. Key NATO allies, already uneasy about the prospect of Trump returning to the White House, began to prepare for a scenario where the U.S. might scale back its leadership role in global security. On the Ukrainian side, the situation was even more urgent. Zelensky had staked much of his international strategy on securing unwavering Western support, and Trump's stance had shaken that foundation. His government immediately intensified diplomatic efforts with European leaders, urging them to step up their commitments to Ukraine should U.S. aid be cut or drastically reduced. The European Union responded with mixed signals. While some leaders vowed to fill the gap, others expressed concerns about the economic and military strain of such an effort. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Vladimir Putin and his government celebrated the division. Russian propaganda framed the Trump-Zelensky dispute as a sign that Western unity was crumbling, using it as fuel for their own narratives. Russian military strategists began analyzing whether this newfound uncertainty could be exploited on the battlefield, leading to speculation about a potential escalation in their offensive against Ukraine. As weeks passed, the diplomatic rupture caused by the February 28 meeting began reshaping the 2025 U.S. presidential race. Trump's critics, both domestic and international, used the confrontation as proof that he was unfit to lead on the world stage. His supporters, on the other hand, doubled down on their belief that he was the only candidate willing to put American interests above all else. The question of Ukraine's future became one of the central debates of the election, with the world watching closely to see whether U.S. policy would shift permanently. For Zelensky, the confrontation became a rallying cry. His defiant statement, "If America turns its back on Ukraine, history will remember it. And so will your allies," resonated far beyond Kiev. It became a symbol of Ukraine's resolve to fight on, regardless of political shifts in Washington. But it also underscored a grim reality: Ukraine could no longer depend on the U.S. with certainty. In the end, the meeting of February 28, 2025, was not just another diplomatic disagreement. It was a moment of reckoning, exposing deep fractures in Western strategy and forcing leaders across the world to reconsider their alliances and priorities. It served as a reminder that, in geopolitics, a single conversation behind closed doors can alter the course of history.